A reading from Bear's Library. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Part 1 of 3. When Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself changed into a monstrous cockroach in his bed. He lay on his tough armored back, and raising his head a little, managed to see, sectioned off by little crescent-shaped ridges into segments, the expanse of his arched brown belly, atop which the coverlet perched, forever on the point of slipping off entirely. His numerous legs, pathetically frail by contrast to the rest of him, waved feebly before his eyes. "What's the matter with me?" he thought. It was no dream. There, quietly, between the 4 familiar walls, was his room, a normal human room, if always a little on the small side. Over the table, on which an array of cloth samples was spread out — Samsa was a traveling salesman — hung the picture he had only recently clipped from a magazine and set in an attractive gilt frame. It was a picture of a lady in a fur hat and stole, sitting bolt upright, holding in the direction of the onlookers a heavy fur muff into which she had thrust the whole of her forearm. From there Gregor's gaze directed itself towards the window and the drab weather outside. Raindrops could be heard plinking against the tin window ledges, made him quite melancholy. What if I went back to sleep for a while and forgot about all this nonsense, he thought. But that proved quite impossible, because he was accustomed to sleeping on his right side, and in his present state he was unable to find that position. However vigorously he flung himself to his right, he kept rocking on to his back. He must have tried it 100 times, closing his eyes so as not to have to watch his wriggling legs, and only stopped when he felt a slight ache in his side, which he didn't recall having felt before. "Oh, my Lord," he thought, "if only I didn't have to follow such an exhausting profession. On the road, day in, day out, the work is so much more strenuous than it would be in a head office, and then there's the additional ordeal of traveling, worries about train connections, the irregular, bad meals, new people all the time, no continuity, no affection. Devil take it all." He felt a light itch at the top of his belly, slid a little closer to the bedpost, so as to be able to raise his head a little more effectively, found that itchy place, which was covered with a sprinkling of white dots, the significance of which he was unable to interpret. He essayed the place with one of his legs, but hurriedly withdrew it, because the touch caused him to shudder involuntarily. He slid back to his previous position. All this getting up early, he thought, is bound to take its effect. A man needs proper bed rest. There are some other traveling salesmen I could mention who live like harem women. Sometimes, for instance, when I return to the pension in the course of the morning to make a note of that morning's orders, some of those gents are just sitting down to breakfast. I'd like to see what happened if I tried that out with my director sometime. It would be the order of the boot, just like that. That said, it might be just the thing for me. If I didn't have to exercise restraint for the sake of my parents, then I would have quit a long time ago. I would have gone up to that director and told him exactly what I thought of him. He would have fallen off his desk in surprise. That's a peculiar way he has of sitting anyway, up on his desk, and talking down to his staff from on high, making them step up to him very close because he's so hard of hearing. Well, I haven't quite given up hope. Once I've got the money together to pay back what my parents owe him, it may take me another 5 or 6 years, then I'll do it. No question. Then we'll have the parting of the ways, but for the time being, I'd better look sharp because my train leaves at 5. Then he looked across at the alarm clock, ticking away on the bedside table. Great Heavenly Father, he thought. It was 6:30, and the clock hands were moving smoothly forward. In fact, it was after 6:30. It was more like 6:45. Had the alarm not gone off? He could see from the bed that it had been quite correctly set for 4 o'clock. It must have gone off. But how was it possible to sleep calmly through its ringing, which caused even the furniture to shake? Well, his sleep hadn't exactly been calm, but maybe it had been all the more profound. What to do now? The next train left at 7. To catch it meant hurrying like a madman, and his samples weren't yet packed, and he himself didn't feel exactly agile or vigorous. And even if he caught that train, he would still get a carpeting from the director, because the office boy would be on the platform at 5 o'clock and would certainly have reported long since that Gregor hadn't been on the train. That boy was a real piece of work, so utterly beholden to the director, without any backbone or nous. Then what if he called in sick? That would be rather embarrassing, and a little suspicious too, because in the course of the past 5 years, Gregor hadn't once been ill. The director was bound to retaliate by calling in the company doctor, would upbraid the parents for their idle son, and refute all objections by referring to the doctor, for whom there were only perfectly healthy but work-shy patients. And who could say he was wrong? In this instance, anyway, aside from a continuing feeling of sleeplessness that was quite unreasonable after such a long sleep, Gregor felt perfectly well, and even felt the stirrings of a healthy appetite. As he was hurriedly thinking this, still no nearer to getting out of bed, the alarm clock was just striking 7:15. There was a cautious knock on the door behind him. "Gregor," came the call. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Shouldn't you ought to be gone by now?" The mild voice. Gregor was dismayed when he heard his own in response. It was still without doubt his own voice, from before, but with a little admixture of an irrepressible squeaking that left the words only briefly recognizable at the first instance of their sounding, only to set about them afterwards so destructively that one couldn't be at all sure what one had heard. Gregor had wanted to offer a full explanation of everything, but in these circumstances kept himself to, "All right, thank you, Mother, I'm getting up." The wooden door must have muted the change in Gregor's voice, because his mother seemed content with his reply and shuffled away. But the brief exchange had altered other members of the family to the surprising fact that Gregor was still at home. And already there was his father knocking on the door, at the side of the room, feebly, but with his fist. "Gregor, Gregor," he shouted, "what's the matter?" And after a little while he came again in a lower octave. "Gregor, Gregor." On the door, on the other side of the room, meanwhile, he heard his sister lamenting softly. "Oh, Gregor, are you not well? Can I bring you anything?" To both sides equally, Gregor replied, "Just coming," and tried by careful enunciation and long pauses between the words to take an unusual quality from his voice. His father soon returned to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, please will you open the door?" Gregor entertained no thought of doing so. Instead, he gave silent thanks for the precaution picked up on his travels of locking every door at night, even at home. His immediate intention was to get up calmly and leisurely, to get dressed and, above all, to have breakfast before deciding what to do next, because he was quite convinced he wouldn't arrive at any sensible conclusions as long as he remained in bed. There were many times, he remembered, when he had lain in bed with a sense of dim pain somewhere in his body, perhaps from lying awkwardly, which then turned out, as he got up, to be mere imaging, and he looked forward to his present fanciful state gradually falling from him. He had not the least doubt that the alteration in his voice was just the first sign of a head cold, always an occupational malady when traveling as a salesman. Casting off the blanket proved to be straightforward indeed. All he needed to do was inflate himself a little, and it fell off by itself, but further tasks were more problematic, not least because of his great breadth. He would have needed arms and hands with which to get up, instead of which all he had were those numerous little legs, forever in varied movement, and evidently not under his control. If he wanted to bend one of them, then it was certain that that was the one that was next fully extended, and once he finally succeeded in performing whatever task he had set himself with that leg, then all its neglected fellows would be in a turmoil of painful agitation. "Whatever I do, I mustn't loaf around in bed," Gregor said to himself. At first, he thought, he would get out of bed bottom half first, but his bottom half of himself, which he had yet to see, and as to whose specifications he was perfectly ignorant, turned out to be not very maneuverable. Progress was slow, and when at last, almost in fury, he pushed down with all his strength, he misjudged the direction and collided with the lower bedpost. The burning pain he felt teaching him that his lower end of himself might well be for the moment the most sensitive to pain. He therefore tried to lever his top half out of bed first, and cautiously turned his head towards the edge of the bed. This was easily done, and in spite of its breadth and bulk, the rest of his body slowly followed the direction of the head. But now, craning his neck in empty space well away from the bed, he was afraid to move any further, because if he were to fall in that position, it would take a miracle if he didn't injure his head, and he mustn't lose consciousness at any price. It were better then to stay in bed. But as he sighed and lay there at the end of his endeavors, and once again beheld his legs struggling, if anything, harder than before, and saw no possibility of bringing any order or calm to their randomness, he told himself once more that he couldn't possibly stay in bed, and that the most sensible solution was to try anything that offered even the smallest chance of getting free of his bed. At the same time, he didn't forget to remind himself periodically that clarity and calm were better than counsels of despair. At such moments, he leveled his gaze as sharply as possible at the window, but unfortunately there was little solace or encouragement to be drawn from the sight of the morning fog, which was thick enough to obscure even the opposite side of the street. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself, as his alarm clock struck another quarter. 7 o'clock already, and still such a dense fog. And he lay there for a while longer, panting gently, as though perhaps expecting that silence would restore the natural order of things. But then he said to himself, by 7:15, I must certainly have got out of bed completely. In any case, somebody will have come from work by then to ask after me, because the business opens before 7 o'clock. And he set about rhythmically rocking his body clear of the bed. If he dropped out of the bed in that way, then he would try to raise his head sharply at the last moment, so that it remained uninjured. His back seemed to be tough. A fall onto the carpet would surely not do it any harm. What most concerned him was the prospect of the loud crash he would surely cause, which would presumably provoke anxiety, if not consternation, behind all the doors. But that was a risk he had to take. As Gregor was already half clear of the bed, this latest method felt more like play than serious exertion, requiring him only to rock himself from side to side. He thought how simple everything would be if he had some help, 2 strong people. He thought of his father and the servant girl. Would easily suffice. They needed only to push their arms under his curved back, peel him out of bed, bend down under his weight, and then just pay attention while they flipped him over onto the floor, where his legs would hopefully come into their own. But then, even if the doors hadn't been locked, could he have really contemplated calling for help? Even in his extremity, he couldn't repress a smile at the thought. He had already reached the point where his rocking was almost enough to send him off balance, and he would soon have to make up his mind once and for all what he was going to do, because it was 7:10, when the doorbell rang. It must be someone from work, he said to himself, and went almost rigid, while his little legs, if anything, increased their agitation. For a moment there was silence. They won't open the door, Gregor said to himself, from within some mad hope. But then, of course, as always, the servant girl walked with firm stride to the door and opened it. Gregor needed only to hear the first word from the visitor to know that it was the chief clerk in person. Why only was Gregor condemned to work for a company where the smallest lapse was greeted with the gravest suspicion? Were all the employees, without exception, scoundrels? Were there really no loyal and dependable individuals among them who, if once a couple of morning hours were not exploited for work, were driven so demented by pangs of conscience that they were unable to get out of bed? Was it really not enough to send a trainee to inquire, if inquiries were necessary at all? And did the chief clerk need to come in person, thereby demonstrating to the whole blameless family that the investigation of Gregor's delinquency could only be entrusted to the seniority and trained intelligence of a chief clerk? And more on account of the excitement that came over Gregor with these reflections than as a result of any proper decision on his part, he powerfully swung himself right out of the bed. There was a loud impact, though not a crash as such. The fall was somewhat muffled by the carpet. Moreover, his back was suppler than Gregor had expected, and therefore the result was a dull thump, and did not draw such immediate attention to itself. Only he had been a little careless of his head, and had bumped it. Frantic with rage and pain, he turned and rubbed it against the carpet. "Something's fallen down in there," said the chief clerk in the hallway on the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether the chief clerk had ever experienced something similar to what had happened to himself today. Surely it was within the bounds of possibility. But as if in blunt reply to his question, the chief clerk now took a few decisive steps next door, his patent leather boots creaking. From the room on the right, his sister now whispered to Gregor, "Gregor, the chief clerk's here." "I know," Gregor replied to himself, but he didn't dare say it sufficiently loudly for his sister to hear. "Gregor," his father now said from the left-hand room, "the chief clerk has come, and wants to know why you weren't on the early train. We don't know what to tell him. He wants a word with you, too, so kindly open the door. I'm sure he'll turn a blind eye to the untidiness in your room." "Good morning, Mr. Samsa," called the cheery voice of the chief clerk. "He's not feeling well," Gregor's mother interjected to the chief clerk, while his father was still talking by the door. "He's not feeling well, believe me, chief clerk. How otherwise could Gregor miss his train? You know that boy has nothing but work in his head. It almost worries me that he never goes out on his evenings off. He's been in the city now for the past week, but he spent every evening at home. He sits at the table quietly, reading the newspaper, or studying the railway timetable. His only hobby is a little occasional woodwork. In the past 2 or 3 evenings, he's carved a little picture frame. I think you'll be surprised by the workmanship. He's got it up on the wall in his room. You'll see it the instant Gregor opens the door. You've no idea how happy I am to see you, chief clerk. By ourselves, we would never have been able to induce Gregor to open the door. He's so obstinate, and I'm sure he's not feeling well, even though he told us he's fine. I'm just coming," Gregor said slowly and deliberately, not stirring, so as not to miss a single word of the conversation outside. "I'm sure you're right, madam," said the chief clerk. "I only hope it's nothing serious, though again I have to say that, unhappily or otherwise, we business people often find ourselves in the position of having to set aside some minor ailment in the greater interest of our work. So can we admit the chief clerk now?" asked his impatient father, knocking on the door again. "No," said Gregor. In the left-hand room there was now an awkward silence, while on the right his sister began to sob. Why didn't his sister go and join the others? She had presumably only just got up, and hadn't started getting dressed yet. And then why was she crying? Because he wouldn't get up and admit the chief clerk, because he was in danger of losing his job, and because the director would then pursue his parents with the old claims. Surely those anxieties were still premature at this stage. Gregor was still here, and wasn't thinking at all about leaving the family. For now he was sprawled on the carpet, and no one knew who was aware of his condition and could have seriously expected that he would allow the chief clerk into his room. But this minor breach of courtesy, for which he could easily find an explanation later, hardly constituted reason enough for Gregor to be sent packing. Gregor thought it was much more sensible for them to leave him alone now, rather than bother him with tears and appeals. It was just the uncertainty that afflicted the others, and accounted for their behavior. "Mr. Samsa," the chief clerk now called out loudly, "what's the matter? You've barricaded yourself into your room. You give us one-word answers. You cause your parents grave and needless anxiety. And this, just by the by, you're neglecting your official duties in quite unconscionable way. I am talking to you on behalf of your partners and the director, and I now ask you in all seriousness for a prompt and full explanation. I must say I'm astonished. I'm astonished. I had taken you for quite a sensible individual, but you seem set on indulging a bizarre array of moods. This morning the director suggested a possible reason for your missing your train. It was to do with the authority to collect payments recently entrusted to you. But I practically gave him my word of honor that that couldn't be the explanation. Now, though, in view of your baffling obstinacy, I'm losing all inclination to speak up on your behalf. And your position is hardly the most secure. I had originally come with the intention of telling you as much in confidence, but as you seem to see fit to waste my time, I really don't know why your parents shouldn't get to hear about it as well. Your performances of late have been extremely unsatisfactory. It's admittedly not the time of year for the best results. We freely concede that. But a time of year for no sales, that doesn't exist in our calendars, Mr. Samsa, and it mustn't exist. But Chief Clerk, Gregor exclaimed, in his excitement forgetting everything else, I'll let you in right away. A light indisposition, a fit of giddiness, have prevented me from getting up. I'm still lying in bed, but I feel almost restored. I'm even now getting out of bed. Just one moment's patience. It seems I'm not as much improved as I'd hoped, but I feel better just the same. How is it something like this can befall a person? Only last night I felt fine. My parents will confirm it to you. Or rather, last night I had a little inkling already of what lay ahead. It probably showed in my appearance somewhere. Why did I not think to inform work? It's just that one always imagines that one will get over an illness without having to take time off, Chief Clerk. Sir, spare my parents. All those complaints you bring against me, they're all of them groundless. It's the first I've heard of any of them. Perhaps you haven't yet pursued the last batch of orders I sent in. By the way, I mean to set out on the 8 o'clock train. The couple of hours' rest have done me the world of good, Chief Clerk. Don't detain yourself any longer. I'll be at work myself presently. Kindly be so good as to let them know, and pass on my regards to the director. While Gregor blurted all this out, almost unaware of what he was saying, he had moved fairly effortlessly, no doubt aided by the practice he had had in bed, up to the bedside table, and now attempted to haul himself into an upright position against it. He truly had it in mind to open the door, to show himself and to speak to the chief clerk. He was eager to learn what the others, who were all clamoring for him, would say when they got to see him. If they were shocked, then Gregor would have no more responsibility and could relax. Whereas if they took it all calmly, then he wouldn't have any cause for agitation either. And if he hurried, he might still get to the station by 8 o'clock. To begin with, he could get no purchase on the smooth bedside table, but at last he gave himself one more swing, and stood there upright. He barely noticed the pain in his lower belly, though it did burn badly. Then he let himself drop against the back of a nearby chair, whose edges he clasped with some of his legs. With that he had attained mastery over himself, and was silent, because now he could listen to the chief clerk. "Did you understand a single word of that?" the chief clerk asked Gregor's parents. "You don't suppose he's pulling our leg, do you?" "In the name of God," his mother cried, her voice already choked with tears. "Perhaps he's gravely ill, and we're tormenting him." "Greta, Greta," she called out. "Mother," his sister called back from the opposite side. They were communicating with one another through Gregor's rooms. "Go to the doctor right away. Gregor's ill. Hurry and fetch that doctor. Were you able to hear him just now?" "That was the voice of an animal," said the chief clerk, striking much more quietly than his mother and her screaming. "Anna, Anna," his father shouted through the hallway, in the direction of the kitchen, and clapping his hands, "get that locksmith right away." And already 2 girls in rustling skirts were hurrying through the hallway. However, had his sister managed to dress so quickly, and out through the front door? There wasn't the bang of it closing either. Probably they had left it open, as happens at times when a great misfortune has taken place. Meanwhile, Gregor had become much calmer. It appeared his words were no longer comprehensible, though to his own hearing they seemed clear enough, clearer than before, perhaps because his ear had become attuned to the sound. But the family already had the sense of all not being well with him, and were ready to come to his assistance. The clarity and resolve with which the first instructions had been issued did him good. He felt himself back within the human ambit, and from both parties, doctor and locksmith, without treating them really in any way as distinct from one another, he hoped for magnificent and surprising feats. In order to strengthen his voice for the decisive conversations that surely lay ahead, he cleared his throat a few times, as quietly as possible, as it appeared that even this sound was something other than a human cough, and he no longer trusted himself to tell the difference. Next door, things had become very quiet. Perhaps his parents were sitting at the table holding whispered consultations with the chief clerk, or perhaps they were all pressing their ears to the door and listening. Gregor slowly pushed himself across to the door with the chair. There he let go of it and dropped against the door, holding himself in an upright position against it. The pads of his little legs secreted some sort of sticky substance, and there rested a moment from his exertions. And then he set himself with his mouth to turn the key in the lock. Unfortunately, it appeared that he had no teeth as such. What was he going to grip the key with? But luckily, his jaws were very powerful. With their help, he got the key to move, and he didn't stop to consider that he was certainly damaging himself in some way, because a brown liquid came out of his mouth and ran over the key and dribbled onto the floor. "Listen," the chief clerk was saying next door. "He's turning the key." This was a great encouragement for Gregor, but they all of them should have called out to him, his father and mother too. "Go, Gregor!" They should have shouted, "Go, Gregor! Keep at it! Work at that lock!" And with the idea that they were all following his efforts with tense concentration, he bit fast on that key with all the strength he possessed, to the point where he was ready to black out. The more the key moved in the door, the more he danced around the lock, and now he was holding himself upright with just his mouth, and depending on the position, he either hung from the key or was pressing against it with the full weight of his body. The light click of the snapping lock brought Gregor around, as from a spell of unconsciousness. Sighing with relief, he said to himself, "Well, I didn't need the locksmith after all," and he rested his head on the door handle to open the door fully. As he had to open the door in this way, it was already fairly ajar while he himself was still out of sight. He first had to twist around one half of the door, and very cautiously at that, if he wasn't to fall flat on his back just at the point of making his entry into the room. He was still taken up with the difficult maneuver, and didn't have time to think about anything else, when he heard the chief clerk emit a sharp "oh," and it actually sounded like the rushing wind, and then he saw him as well, standing nearest to the door, his hand pressed against his open mouth, and slowly retreating, as if being pushed back by an invisible but irresistible force. Gregor's mother, in spite of the chief clerk's arrival, she was standing there with her hair loose, though now it was standing up stiffly in the air, first looked at his father with folded hands, then took 2 steps forward towards Gregor, and collapsed in the middle of her skirts, spreading out around her, her face irretrievably sunk against her bosom. His father clenched his fist with a pugnacious expression, as if ready to push Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and cried, his mighty chest shaking with sobs. Now Gregor didn't even set foot in the room, but leaned against the inside of the fixed half of the door, so that only half his body could be seen, and the head with which he was peering across at the others cocked on its side a little. It was much brighter now. A little section of the endless gray-black frontage of the building opposite, it was a hospital, could clearly be seen, and its rhythmically recurring windows. It was still raining, but now only in single large drops, individually fashioned with and flung to the ground. The breakfast things were out on the table in profusion, because of his father's breakfast was the most important meal of the day, which he liked to draw out for hours over the perusal of several newspapers. Just opposite, on the facing wall, was a photograph of Gregor, from his period in the army, as a lieutenant, his hand on his saber, smiling confidently, the posture and uniform demanding respect. The door to the hallway was open, and as the front door was open too, one could see out to the landing and the top of the flight of the stairs down. "Now," said Gregor, in the knowledge that he was the only one present to have maintained equanimity, "I'm just going to get dressed, pack up my samples, and then I'll set off. Do you want to let me set out, do you? You see, Chief Clerk, you see, I'm not stubborn. I like my work. The travel is arduous, but I couldn't live without it. Where are you off to, Chief Clerk? To work? Is that right? Will you accurately report everything you've seen here? It is possible to be momentarily unfit for work, but that is precisely the time to remind oneself of one's former achievements, and to reflect that, once the present obstacle has been surmounted, one's future work will be all the more diligent and focused. As you know all too well, I am under a very great obligation to the director. In addition, I have responsibilities for my parents and my sister. I am in a jam, but I will work my way out of it. Only don't make it any harder for me than it is already. Give me your backing at head office. I know the traveling salesman is not held in the highest regard there. People imagine he seems a packet and has a nice life on top of it. These and similar assumptions remain unexamined. But you, Chief Clerk, you have a great understanding of the circumstances than the rest of the staff. You even, if I may say this to you in confidence, have an understanding superior to that of the director himself, who, as an entrepreneur, is perhaps too easily swayed against an employee. You are also very well aware that the traveling salesman, spending as he does the best part of the year away from the head office, may all too easily fall victim to tittle-tattle, to mishants, and to baseless allegations, against which he has no way of defending himself, mostly even does not get to hear of, and when he returns exhausted from his travels, it is to find himself confronted directly by practical consequences of those and whose causes he is ignorant. Chief Clerk, don't leave without showing me a word or two of your own that you at least partly agree with me." But the chief clerk had turned his back on Gregor the moment he had begun speaking, and only stared back at him with mouth agape over his trembling shoulder. All the while Gregor was speaking, he wasn't still for a moment, but without taking his eyes off Gregor, moved towards the door, but terribly, gradually, as though in breach of some secret injunction not to leave the room. Already he was in the hallway, and to judge by the sudden movement with which he snatched his foot back out of the living room for the last time, one might have supposed he had burned his soul. Once in the hallway, he extended his right hand fervently in the direction of the stairs, as though some supernatural salvation there awaited him. Gregor understood that he must on no account allow the chief clerk to leave his present frame of mind, not if he wasn't to risk damage to his place in the company. His parents didn't seem to grasp this issue with the same clarity. Over the course of many years they had acquired the conviction that in this business Gregor had a job for life, and besides, they were so consumed by their anxieties of the present moment that they had lost any premonitory sense they might have had. Gregor thought the chief clerk had to be stopped, calmed, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family depended on that. If only his sister were back already. There was a shrewd person. She had begun to cry even as Gregor was still lying calmly on his back, and no doubt that the chief clerk, notorious skirt chaser that he was, would have allowed himself to be influenced by her. She would have closed the front door, and in the hallway talked him out of his panic. But his sister wasn't there. Gregor would have to act on his own behalf, without stopping to think that he didn't understand his given locomotive powers, without even thinking that this latest speech of his had possibly, no probably, not been understood either. He left the shelter of the half-door and pushed through the opening, making for the chief clerk, who was laughably holding on to the balustrade on the landing with both hands. But straight away, looking for a grip, Gregor dropped with a short cry onto his many little legs. No sooner had this happened than for the first time that morning he felt a sense of physical well-being. The little legs had solid ground under them, and they obeyed perfectly, as he noticed to his satisfaction, even seeking to carry him where he wanted to go. And he was on the point of believing a final improvement in his condition was imminent. But at that very moment, while he was still swaying from his initial impetus, not far from his mother and just in front of her on the ground, she, who had seemed so utterly immersed in herself, suddenly leaped into the air, arms wide, fingers spread, and screamed, "Help! Oh, please, God, help me!" Inclined her head as though for a better view of Gregor, but then, quite at a variance with that, ran senselessly away from him. She forgot the breakfast table was behind her. On reaching it, she hurriedly, in her distractedness, sat down on it, seeming oblivious to the fact that coffee was gushing all over the carpet from the large upset coffee pot. Mother, Gregor said softly, looking up at her. He forgot all about the chief clerk. On the other hand, he couldn't help but move his jaws several times at the sight of the flowing coffee. At this, his mother screamed again and fled from the table into the arms of Gregor's father, who was rushing towards her. But now Gregor had no time for this parent. The chief clerk was already on the stairs, his chin on the balustrade. He stared behind him one last time. Gregor moved sharply to be sure of catching up. The chief clerk must have sensed something, because he took the last few steps at a single bound and disappeared. "Oof!" he managed to cry, the sound echoing through the stairwell. Regrettably, the consequence of the chief clerk's flight was finally to turn the sense of his father, who to that point had remained relatively calm, because instead of himself taking off after the man, or at least not getting in the way of Gregor as he attempted to do just that, he seized in his right hand the chief clerk's cane, which he had left behind on a chair along with his hat and coat. With his left, grabbed a large newspaper from the table, and by stamping his feet and brandishing stick and newspaper, attempted to drive Gregor back into his room. No pleas on Gregor's part were any use. No pleas were even noticed. However imploringly he might turn his head, his father only stamped harder with his feet. Meanwhile, in spite of the cool temperature, his mother had thrown open a window on the other side of the room and, leaning out of it, plunged her face in her hands. A powerful draught was created between the stairwell and the street outside. The window curtains flew up. The newspapers rustled on the table. Some individual pages fluttered across the floor. His father was moving forward, implacably, emitting hissing sounds like a savage. Gregor had no practice in moving backwards, and he was moving, it had to be said, extremely slowly. If he had been able to turn around, he would have been back in his room in little or no time, but he was afraid lest the delay incurred in turning around would make his father impatient, and at any moment the stick in his father's hand threatened to strike him a fatal blow to the back of the head. Finally, Gregor had no alternative, because he noticed in his consternation that his reversing he was unable to keep to a given course, and so, with continual, fearful, sidelong looks to his father, He started as quickly as possible, but in effect only very slowly, to turn around. It was possible that his father was aware of his good intentions, because he didn't obstruct him, but even directed the turning maneuver from a distance with gestures from his cane. If only there hadn't been those unbearable hissing sounds issuing from his father. They caused Gregor to lose all orientation. He had turned almost completely around. When distracted by the hissing, he lost his way and moved a little in the wrong direction. Then, when he found himself with his head successfully in the doorway, it became apparent that his body was too wide to slip through it. To his father, in his present frame of mind, it didn't remotely occur to open the other wing of the door and so make enough space for Gregor. He was rather obsessed with the notion of getting Gregor back in his room, post-haste. He could not possibly have countenanced the cumbersome preparations Gregor would have required to get up and perhaps so get around the door. Rather, as though there were no hindrance at all, he drove Gregor forward with even greater din. The sound to Gregor's ears was not that of one father alone. Now it was really no laughing matter, and Gregor drove himself, happen what might, against the door. One side of his body was canted up. He found himself lifted at an angle in the doorway. His flank was rubbed raw, and some ugly stains appeared on the white door. Before long he was caught fast and could not have moved any more unaided. His little legs on one side were trembling in mid-air, while those on the other found themselves painfully pressed against the ground. When from behind his father now gave him a truly liberating kick, and he was thrown, bleeding profusely, far into his room. The door was battered shut with the cane, and then at last there was quiet. This concludes part 1 of our reading of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Part 2 and 3 will come up in subsequent weeks. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe for updates. Bear out.